Hey folks, Dust here, and I wanted to discuss Boltz joining Luminosity, or depending on how you look at it, rejoining Luminosity. Obviously, Boltz had played under this organization in the past, alongside Steel, through much of 2015, until that team had made the decision to remove Steel and Boltz to bring in FNX and Taco. And of course, that team, alongside the core of Fallen Fur and Cold, went on to be one of the greatest CSGO lineups of all time, and certainly the best Brazilian team we've ever had in CSGO. At that point, those two players really went their separate ways. I mean, Boltz had kind of stayed alongside guys like Henny and Lucas and formed this Tempo Storm team that had some success through 2016 and evolved into Immortals. Steel then went on to play in Brazil for a time with Gex and a couple of other teams, eventually rejoined when, Boltz and the core of that Tempo Storm team became Immortals and played together through a lot of 2017 before all the drama happened with DreamHack Montreal. And obviously at that point, Steel went for a time to play with Team Liquid, and Boltz obviously went over to SK. And Boltz hasn't really played since he was dropped from that team when they became made in Brazil. When they made a decision to remove him from the team, he's been pretty much inactive, sitting on the bench because of contract. And then Steel obviously went on to play with Luminosity, and kind of that's where we are at now, basically, to give you a little bit of a brief history lesson. Because yeah, it was announced not too long ago that Boltz had been released from his contract with Made in Brazil, and the writing was pretty much on the wall at that point that surely a team like Luminosity, maybe that INTZ team, was certainly going to be looking to grab Boltz now that he was essentially a free agent. They weren't going to have to do some type of contract buyout. I mean, he's too good of a player not to pick up on if you're one of these other Brazilian teams that are trying to take a step up on the totem pole. And so yeah, the writing was really on the wall at that point. And yeah, he does come in for Luminosity for Yell, and that is what their lineup is going to be going forward, unless they decide to make some changes between now and when they play again, because right now there's not really much going on for them. I know they are playing online in the minor qualifiers. I'm making this video. We'll have to see if they make it to the minor. If not, don't know when we would see them play again. Maybe they get invited to the iBuyPower Masters event if they don't make it to the minor. Maybe they're going to, not really have any official play for a while and have a chance to try to regroup and retool this team. Because, to be honest with you, Luminosity was in desperate need for a roster change. They have been really struggling throughout 2018. And really, the Luminosity organization has been struggling since late 2016 in October, when they picked up their new Brazilian lineup after, the core of Fur, Cold, and Fallen departed. Because remember, their first foray back into Counter-Strike, when they lost that team to SK in a really controversial way in 2016, was to pick up this team that had PKL, Showtime, Destiny, Yell, and Shiz. And none of those players are still left on this team except for Yell. He is the one piece that remains through all the different iterations of the team, because remember, they get brought in people like Nekus and Cello at one point. They had Steel obviously come in later. Now they had Henny and Lucas sign, earlier this year. So they've been through several different, iterations of this team. And unfortunately for them, they really have just been on a steep decline. I mean, this team were just constantly going out in group stages at pretty much every single LAN event they attended. I mean, if you go really far back, like into the late 2016 late 2017 time period, I should say, going out in groups in Montreal, going out in groups at DreamHack Denver, going, not qualifying for events like IEM Oakland or Epicenter, going out in the group stages of the America's Minor for E-League Boston, the EPL Season 6 finals, the ECS Season 4 finals, again, all group stage exits, a bunch of events they weren't able to qualify for. After that, going like IEM Katowice, IEM Sydney, Starladder Season 4, DreamHack Masters Malmo, Starlighter Season 5, Belo Horizonte, just none of these events they were even able to qualify for. And then again, there are rare occasions that they would get to LAN events, they would go out in the group stages. The only exceptions to this really was that really good run they had at DreamHack Open Valencia this year when they first got Henny and Lucas. It was kind of their debut event with the new lineup. And at that event, they were able to qualify for it really well throughout the online portion on NA, beating out Bravado Rogue and E United. And then at the event itself, they did pretty well. I mean, they were able to get second place. They lost to North in the finals after beating Heroic in the semis and beating teams like G2, actually just G2. They played them twice in that group stage to make it to the semifinals. And then, they were able to qualify for IEM Chicago, so that was a pretty good little online bump for them. But once they got to Chicago, again, another group stage exit, despite being able to beat Avangard and E United. They lost to Mouse Sports in the decider best of 3 that would have put them in the playoffs. Then we saw them at a couple of other events. They did qualify for DreamHack Atlanta, and this was the only other time besides DreamHack Valencia that they got out of the group stage of Atlanta event. At this event, they actually made it all the way to the finals again, similar to Valencia. They lost to Vitality in the finals, of course, after actually beating Ghost in a really big best-of-3 in the semifinals. I mean, that was actually a pretty huge offline result for them, especially since Ghost has really been building themselves up lately in the NA scene and even internationally to a degree. They've definitely had some pretty cool map pickups on teams like Navi and such, so that was definitely a pretty solid team to beat. But in many other areas, his team was slipping. I mean, for one, they have been relegated to Mountain Dew League. For two, they are going to be back in challengers for ECS, so they're not guaranteed a spot in the next season of ECS. So they're basically potentially out of both professional leagues that you want to be a part of right now if you are a top team. And, again, like there's been many occasions where they haven't been able to qualify for LAN events. There's been so many occasions where they've gone on group stages in LAN events. Again, the only exceptions being Atlanta and Valencia for essentially the last 2 years. And granted, there's been a lot of roster changes throughout all that. It's not necessarily the same team. Again, Yell's the only piece that was remaining, at least through DreamHack Atlanta until they made this change where they dropped Yell for Boltz. But, yeah, I mean, it's just a long history of really struggling offline. And even with that, though, they were typically always kind of a middle-of-the-pack team in North America. They were typically able to qualify for Pro League finals for EPL and ECS. I talked about that a little bit earlier when they did make the EPL Season 6 finals and the ECS Season 4 finals. It's, of course, December of 2017 when they were doing that. So, about a year ago from now, basically, when they were able to do that. But since then, they've really slipped in those professional leagues, and they haven't been a shoe-in to qualify for some of these DreamHack Opens and other events anymore. Other teams in North America have started to kind of step over them, like a Complexity, like an E United, like a Ghost, who has certainly kind of skipped ahead of a lot of different people. Like Rogue is another example you can put in there. So, yeah, they really have fallen behind. And so the idea of them needing to make a change, I think, was bloody apparent. And the other thing to think about here is that, ever since Henny and Lucas joined the team, particularly Henny in the comparison I'm going to make, you could always tell that Yell is really out of place. I mean, he was the former primary opper of the team. He was the one guy on the team that through all their changes really did show a lot of promise, and other teams were interested in him. It was very important for Luminosity to keep a hold of Yell because he was performing pretty well at AWP. He was kind of their reliable players, so to speak. But when you bring Henny on board, you're obviously going to give him the primary op. And look, that means you're going to have a pretty powerful double AWP setup, particularly on CT sides, but it means that Yell's going to be a little bit out of place when he had to play a rifling role. And that was very much the case. They tried him as a little bit of a lurker type peripheral role player for a while. That didn't really work. His numbers definitely tanked. They were trying to get him a little bit more active a little bit later on. Still wasn't necessarily performing individually that well. And hell, lately at DreamHack Atlanta, he was the damn in-game leader for the team. I think that was actually even the case at IEM Chicago. So, I mean, they were trying to figure out ways they could still implement Yell despite the fact despite the fact Henny was taking over primary AWP duties, but it just never materialized into anything that was consistent. I mean, yeah, they had a really good run at DreamHack Atlanta, but you could just tell that, man, was this really going to be sustainable? Because the system they were running at DreamHack Atlanta was Steel was no longer the in-game leader, it was Yell. They were using Steel as an entry fragger / second entry, or at least a main focus of grabbing map control and executing bomb sites, when this dude for the pretty much entire career that I've seen has been more of a peripheral role player, more of a lurker, more supportive, at times been an in-game leader. So they were using Steel in a much different way than they ever had before. They were actually using Lucas in more peripherals than I'm used to, because classically throughout Tempo Storm and other teams, he was actually part of an entry duo with Phelps, through a lot of Tempo Storm and Immortals, and he always seemed to be more of a guy that would be prone to play those types of positions. He was being used a little bit more on the edge of the map. Steel was being more active. Yell was in-game leading. They were playing a much looser, kind of just based on individual playmaking style of play, whereas before, when Steel was the in-game leader of the team, they were playing like a much slower, more structured, more default style of CS. So they were really trying to really just go nuts at the DreamHack Atlanta event, really just kind of change everything. And the result was Nekis was playing much better than he ever really had, except for him having a pretty good one-off good performance at DreamHack Valencia. Steel was dropping big numbers, which is not normally something he's known for. He's more known for having value in other areas of the game than being a big-name fragger. Henny was popping off, which definitely can happen. That definitely is probably the star player of the team when you think about it. But yeah, man, like it was just, was this really going to be sustainable? Was this style of play really going to be something they could rely on going forward? Was Yell as an in-game leader truly something that you could count on? It just seemed very unlikely. And even in some of the post-game interviews that Steele did at DreamHack Atlanta when I was on the desk, you could just kind of tell that, you know, he wasn't even necessarily invested in the idea of keeping this type of game plan long term. And so, yes, they definitely needed to change. Definitely were struggling. Definitely were almost kind of in panic mode, changing up roles, swapping play styles, doing all these different things to try to get the most out of the lineup before they needed to make a change. And so the change they've made is to bring in Boltz. Now, what is this going to mean for Luminosity? Well, I would imagine that Henny is going to remain the primary opera of the team. That's not going to change. Very aggressive, very flashy player, is putting up really good numbers. At times has put up really good numbers throughout his history. He's always been considered a great player. A little bit frustrating at times because kind of like the meme that Draken got put in more recently is the same kind of meme that Henny was in before, where he hit all the crazy flashy shots, but he missed the easier ones or the more basic ones. He would take those risky types of, you know, fast flick style aim duels, and it would look really cool when he hit shots, but then when he missed kind of the more basic shots, it really make you scratch your head. So he's definitely had that frustration factor, but he definitely is still a really solid, aggressive opera to have on your team. Probably one of the best options you can have right now in the Brazilian scene. If you aren't going to have a KNG or a Fallen, it probably is going to be the best option you really have to try to build something. So that's probably going to stay the same. And he doubles as a pretty decent entry rifler on 5 rifle setups, or someone else is using the op or something. He definitely still has value with an AK-47 in his hands as well. So that'll probably be the same. I imagine Steele would go back to the in-game leader role, but what I am curious to see is he going to go back to being more of a supportive, peripheral type player in the in-game leader slot, or is he going to try to keep what he was doing at DreamHack Atlanta and be more of an entry type fragger? Maybe him and Lucas will pair up and be more entry type fraggers while someone like Boltz is going to play the edge of the map. Maybe it's going to be Steele and Nekus. Maybe Lucas will retain some of the peripheral positions he was playing at DreamHack Atlanta and IM Chicago, and then Boltz will play the other end of the map, and then like Steele and Nekus are going to be kind of an entry duo with Henny being the opera. That's one configuration. The other configuration is to make Lucas back into kind of more of an entry fragger role with Nekus, Henny as your opera, and then Boltz and Steele go back to classically playing the opposite edges of the map like they did together on Immortals, like they did at times on Luminosity way back in the past. So there's a lot of different ways they can approach it, and I'll be curious to see what decision they make based on, you know, what lineup they have now going forward. My problem with Luminosity is that I feel like they still need at least one more change before they're really going to truly be a team that challenges for like a top 15 and maybe sometime in the future a top 10 position in the world. I don't think that this lineup can do it. Because here's the problem. He can be a star player. He can be a big numbers producer, and he definitely can do his job, right? I think Boltz should now finally be back into a position where he can be a stable rifler, but he was never like truly a superstar level player. I mean, even when he was really successful on Tempo Storm and into Immortals before he joined SK, and even, like, remember, the first 4 events he played with SK, that team won 3 out of 4 finals, and he was putting up really good numbers. It wasn't until afterwards that he kind of tanked and dropped off. Even then, though, he never really looked to me like a superstar player. He was definitely stable. He was consistent. To me, he was kind of like your Rock, kind of like an FNX was for, you know, LGSK in the aftermath of Boltz's removal from that team. That's the type of player that Boltz felt like to me. Like, he was probably going to be, hopefully, your 3rd best player. Like, you were going to have 2 really solid star players, then Boltz was going to be that rock right in the middle that you could rely on to put up numbers and just kind of do his job. You know, I think that's what he should be for this team as well, unless they're going to try something crazy. You know, but I think he should be kind of another big numbers producer next to Henny, but I feel like you need one more guy to do that. And I don't know that this LG team really has that because, for one, I don't know that Steele can continue to have the type of numbers he had at DreamHack Atlanta. He's never really classically been known to be a big, you know, frag output type guy. He's a guy that definitely can play a role, definitely can be a good supportive player, definitely can be your in-game leader, definitely can call a structured style of play. He definitely has a lot of value in the different roles he can do, but, you know, I can't know if he's ever actually going to be able to, like, consistently perform like he did at Atlanta. I don't even know if he'll keep the same role he had at Atlanta when he was putting up numbers. Again, I haven't seen him play yet. We'll have to kind of see how it goes with that. Then, you know, Lucas might be another guy you think of to be there, a big fragger, but even he has never really been like, I got to put up massive numbers. Again, he's a guy that plays the role really well. He can be kind of your entry fragger, so to speak, to kind of set someone else up, like he did with Phelps through Tempo Storm and Immortals. He can at times play the edge of the map and be a little bit more supportive, as has been proven a couple of different times, like at DreamHack Atlanta, for instance. But he can be a bit of a playmaker, but even still, he's not going to be like big numbers. He'll do pretty good. But I would say he's probably a little bit below Boltz, and Boltz is not someone who would even be a superstar player either. He would be, like I said, more of your third best player. I feel like Lucas is also kind of a guy that you want to be like your third best player. Like, that's the kind of position that he would normally be on a team. You would usually want a couple of guys above him really putting up the heavy numbers, and him just kind of playing his role and doing a pretty decent job. And the problem is that Nekis is like the other guy who usually gets put in kind of an entry fragger type role, or second guy in, either behind Lucas or most recently behind Steel. And again, outside of, Valencia and some of the matches at DreamHack Atlanta, he typically has not performed very well. He typically hasn't been a big numbers producer. So again, it's like I have a Henny who can go off. He can be your star level player. I have Boltz who, hopefully, if he can work the rust off, he's obviously haven't played in a while. For whatever reason, he never seems to work out in Fallen's teams, but in other teams, he's definitely had a lot of success. So I'd expect him to, eventually be able to get to a level where hopefully he's like at least stable, fulfills a role. Steel is going to be able to fulfill a role. Lucas is going to be able to fulfill a role. But where's my other like second superstar level player? Maybe it could be Boltz. Maybe. I mean, like maybe he can be a cold type character for this team and kind of be a star from that type of role. But I don't really know. I'd expect him to just be more of like a stable kind of rock player. So I feel like they need another heavy hitter, like secondary entry fragger. Like whoever it is, whether it's going to be Steel or Lucas kind of going in first to set someone else up and maybe get some kills and maybe also additionally pop off. There needs to be that follow-up fragger that flies off that guy and goes out and puts up numbers. And I don't think it's going to be Nekis. So I feel like at some point they're going to need to get rid of Nekis, I think, personally, unless he somehow thrives underneath this new team with Steel and back as an in-game leader and Boltz on board as kind of a rock stable player. But I would think that you need another big name fragger to be like that second guy in to really put up the stats. And I think that options for this team, basically whoever MIBR doesn't get, because apparently they're interested in KNG and K Serato. So I think whoever this team doesn't get one of those guys. Get a K Serato, get a KNG. I know there's a lot of, drama with KNG with all that he did and the apology afterwards and all that good stuff. If you can deal with that, definitely still a valuable player. Definitely has proven he can be a secondary entry type rifler. Definitely can be a powerful secondary op to go alongside Henny. Definitely could be a great combination right there. K Serato is a guy that is a very flexible rifler for Furia. There's been times where he's been a little bit more of a lurk and a bait type player, but I've seen other times where he kind of goes in and makes a play and create a big opening. You let him bait like a Steel or a Lucas or something in a 1-2 punch type setup, and maybe that guy can thrive for you and be a big player. Then guess what? There's still Phelps sitting out there on INTZ. Right now, he's kind of withering away because he's having to be an in-game leader for that team, which is a crime in my opinion, but get that guy. Get him back working with Lucas like they did back in the old days on Tempo Storm 2016. I think Phelps could still have a lot of value as an entry type player. Maybe you try to go that direction. Or look at some of these other players that are on like a Sharks or a Furia or some of these other teams and try to bring up another young player to kind of be that secondary star to Henny, to be that secondary entry type fragger that you really kind of need. I think that those are some things this team really needs to look at going forward. And I'm not really sure when or if that'll happen. But I really do think that this team, with some of the core pieces they have, like a Henny, like a Boltz, like a Steel, you really could be looking to make moves to really move the totem pole, start competing against Complexity, United Rogue, etc., to get back in the middle of the pack in North America and start getting those playoff spots again in pro leagues. Obviously, in the case of, EPL, you're going to have to wait because you have to go back through Mountain Dew League to get back in EPL. But ECS, dominate challengers, get back in there, get to those finals. Start qualifying for DreamHack Open events on the regular. Get yourself in position to get directly invited to those events. Start qualifying for Tier 1 events. Start making some noise. The way you could do that is building off of people like Boltz and Steel and Henny, but I feel like you need that one more piece. But we'll just have to see. Maybe someone does pop off and they don't need to do that, but I really feel like it's going to come down to that at some point. But the point is that some of the core pieces, that foundation is there to do that again, to finally have a second Brazilian team that can be interesting internationally, because we haven't had that in a really long time, to be quite honest. You know, we used to have it when you had like Immortals and SK going at it, and both of them were like top 10 teams in the world. You know, SK was usually always able to beat Immortals, except for a couple of occasions. But, you know, at least we did have two Brazilian teams in the top. And there's definitely still enough talent to do that again. And I think that this Luminosity team is in the best position to probably do that after Made in Brazil makes their moves that are kind of rumored to happen with, you know, either KNG or K-Strada or whomever to come over to make that team full Brazilian again. So that's just my thoughts on Boltz joining Luminosity and kind of just my thoughts on Luminosity lately and what their future could be. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please follow and subscribe for more content. Thanks so much.